He talks with Hannah Rosen, a journalist who traveled to Patrick Henry College to speak with students at the Evangelical School. This is an hour.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our event on evangelicals in the public square. It's wonderful to have you all with us here today. Let me just explain a little bit how we're going to proceed. I'll introduce our guests, and then we'll talk a bit amongst ourselves about the topic. We'll do that for about half an hour, and then at that point we will entertain questions from you all and proceed until either we run out of questions or our time has expired, whichever happens first. So without further ado, let me introduce our guests. We're delighted to have with us this morning Hannah Rosen, who is on my right, I guess your left, and she is the author of God's Harvard, which we'll talk about today, which is a book about Patrick Henry College. And on my left is Michael Lindsay, who is the author of Faith in the Halls of Power, How Evangelicals Joined the American Elite. And so to begin with, I'd like to just pose a couple of questions to each of our guests and to get our conversation started. Michael, let's begin with you. Which halls of power are evangelicals roaming in these days, and how did they get there?
Yeah, thanks, John. It's great to be here. The book looks at basically how evangelicals have come to be powerful in 4 important areas: government and politics, higher education, arts, entertainment, and media, and business life. And I trace developments starting with Jimmy Carter's election in 1976 and look over the last 30 years how evangelicals have moved up in power in these different spheres. And I found that these are kind of the 4 central domains, in my opinion, where evangelical activism has been around. One of the things that surprised me is that a lot of us assume that most of evangelicals' influence is in politics. That's where a lot of the attention has gone. But I found there's a whole lot more resources being devoted, for example, to evangelical activism in Hollywood, as well as on elite college campuses, than we pay a lot of attention to. And so I think it's a significant development. Peter Gomes says that there's more evangelicals on Harvard's campus today than there have been in 200 years. And he's been there as the chaplain of Memorial Church for the last 40 of those 200 years. So he's in a good position to at least assess that. And a lot of people say, well, why is that? Part of the thing is that as elite campuses have tried to diversify geographically, ethnically, and racially, they've also diversified religiously. And so there are more evangelicals coming to campus. And as research shows us, if you compare evangelical young people with other young people of different traditions, Jews, Roman Catholics, mainline Protestants, evangelicals are the least likely to give up their faith when they go off to college. So you have more of them coming to these elite campuses, and then when they get there, they're not giving up their faith. So places like Harvard and Stanford have been interesting places to study.
Michael, there's a couple of distinctions you use in your book that I'd like you just to comment briefly, because I think they'll be very helpful in our discussion. You draw a distinction between the institutional advances that evangelicals have made and then their expressive advances. Yeah. And I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about those terms.
Yeah, thanks, John. The institutional element is how evangelicals have built a real infrastructure for cultural change. So their support of organizations, of colleges, of universities, of seminaries, of parachurch organizations, of NGOs around the world. These provide sort of the institutional apparatus, the long-term repositories where evangelicals can sort of mobilize around and get active behind, and they raise funds for and use that institutional basis to give them a sense of cultural authority. But they also have to have rallying cries, ways to sort of talk about their faith that is publicly accessible and that really drives them into making a difference in these different spheres of society. And so the expressive dimension is really important. Voting is actually the kind of exemplar of expressive behavior. When you vote, you're in essence trying to vote for someone that you identify with in one way or another. That's why it's really important to pay attention to how candidates talk about faith or how they talk about other issues, because it's a way in which the voters and the candidates build relationships. So when a voter goes into the voting booth and pulls the curtain, a lot of times when they're casting their vote, it's a way of sort of validating the things that they think are important. And in some ways, when we cast our votes, it's a way of voting for ourselves. It's a way of saying, this particular candidate sort of embodies things that are really important to me. A lot of people assume that evangelicals, don't care about what candidates talk about, that they're just mainly interested in results. Well, results do matter to evangelicals, but God talk matters a whole lot on the campaign trail. So that expressive dimension I found to be as important as the institutions that they've built over the last 30 years.
Well, Michael, I just have one more question for you, and then we'll turn to Hannah and hear about her book. But how does this all matter? I mean, what difference does it make that evangelicals are not only in the White House and voting in an intentional way, but also have influences in Hollywood and on college campuses and so forth?
Yeah, the thing that matters, I think, is that evangelical influence is a whole lot more than we think, and it's a lot less than we think at the same time. It's a whole lot more because if you think of evangelicalism just as a political movement or just as an interest group in American politics, you miss all of the other ways in which evangelicals have been active and are mobilized and are really engaged in American public life. So if you just pay attention to developments in Washington and you forget what's going on in Silicon Valley or on Stanford's campus or what's happening at Wall Street or Harvard or in Hollywood, you miss a lot of the kind of principal ways in which evangelicals have been mobilized over the last 30 years. And in fact, I find that politics is not the area where they are most excited about today. So it's a whole lot more than you think. Why is that important? Because evangelicals are really resilient to political setbacks because they don't see themselves as principally a political movement. So it's a very durable kind of identity. It's a lot less than we think, though, because there's not some great power group that's pulling the strings of this movement that comprises anywhere from a quarter to a third of the adult population. There's not some conspiracy theory. I don't find that this inner cabal. I found, for example, I talk about in the book about how in the exact same White House, evangelicals can oppose one another. So you have C. Everett Koop fighting against Gary Bauer in the Reagan White House over the issue about AIDS and whether AIDS is a public health crisis worthy of the White House's attention. I found these kind of tensions happen all the time, not just in politics, but in lots of other areas. So it's a lot less than we think because it doesn't have that driving sense of unity. People assume that evangelicals have succeeded in American public life because they are united. Not so. The reason evangelicals have succeeded over the last 30 years is quite simply, they fundamentally believe something is wrong with the world and that they know how to set it aright. And that gives them a fire in their belly to be actively engaged. It drives them to being involved in lots of different areas. And if you understand that, you get a much better appreciation, I think, for how evangelicals have come to exert influence within the halls of power.
Well, thank you, Michael. Now let's turn to Hannah's book. You mentioned the influence of evangelicals in higher education. And, of course, Hannah's book is exactly about that in a very particular way. So, Hannah, would you mind telling us briefly about God's Harvard and its mission to save America?
Yes, Patrick Henry College is not actually Harvard or Stanford yet, although it wants to be someday. It's only a 7-year-old school. The reason I chose it is because I thought it was so emblematic of what was going on in evangelical culture these days. It's a school that was founded by Michael Ferris, who was very prominent in the homeschooling movement in the 90s. And also ran for lieutenant governor as one of the first wave of Bible-quoting politicians in 1992. And the school's aim, as they like to say, is to shape the culture and take back the nation. So it's both of these. It's sort of a provocative way of putting it, and it's also both of these things that Michael talked about, focusing on both the culture and politics. Now, they explicitly put themselves close to Washington because they see themselves as a sort of training academy for Washington politicians. So they send a lot of kids to work at the White House, which they've been very successful with this White House for obvious reasons, and conservative congressmen. But they also have kids interested in Hollywood and the other areas that Michael wrote about. And Michael Ferris, who's sort of bombastic, so he takes the most extreme version of what evangelicals are trying to do, will get up every year at freshman orientation and say something like, before me seated today are the next generation of Supreme Court justices, perhaps the next president, the next Academy Award winners. And because the kids have been sort of homeschooled and because they're freshmen and because, like Michael said, they're incredibly driven, so that people who went to school in the 60s will often come to Patrick Henry and say, this reminds me most of college in the 60s. This is like the Peace Corps generation, and you've got these people who fight intensely about ideas and have a mission that they take so seriously. They're not as successful as maybe his wildest dreams, but they're much more successful and driven than your sort of average, ambitious college student.
You know, Hannah, the Christian colleges are not new. Well, they've been around a long time. In fact, the Harvard of Massachusetts was, of course, originally a Christian
college. We hear that a lot at Patrick Henry. What went wrong?
Yeah, and it even had, a mission to save America, quite literally, if my information is correct, it was originally for training ministers. So how does Patrick Henry differ, in your opinion, from the other Christian colleges in America today?
The difference is that, you know, that's what a lot of people say is the arrogance of Mike Ferris, a lot of the other founders of Christian colleges. What do you mean there's no Christian college for ambitious kids? You know, what about Wheaton? What about Calvin? What about all these other places? I think the difference, and what drew me to Patrick Henry, is that, first of all, almost all Christian colleges these days, Baylor and Biola in California, are going through a moment where they've stopped sort of training kids for a sort of parallel, to live in a parallel Christian subculture. That's not what they're interested in doing. Every Christian college is now interested, like